Hello, so I wanted to talk a bit about rebreathers today, so I'll briefly show you my IP5, but the video is not about the IP5 specifically, it's just about rebreathers. And there's this very worrying trend I want to sort of try and hopefully counter to anybody that listens to the reason, where, so IP5 is in this bag, let's just get the top open so you can see the IP5, then I'll close it all back up again. There's a very worrying trend I'm noticing now. So there you go, there's the IP5 if you can see it, and it's got all the big bladder and everything else. I don't have the canister for it. There's this very worrying trend I'm seeing a lot now where people are suggesting rebreathers whenever anybody asks about what should I use, if in case there's any gas or things, people are saying rebreathers. They're not even saying a respirator. They're not saying air-supplied respirators like a fireman would use or something like that. They're just instantly going to rebreathers. Now, you see there's a problem. Half the people are suggesting things like IP4 and IP5s and very old Soviet rebreathers, which back in the day were probably fine, but there's lots of risks associated with rebreathers, and as you get to the old rebreathers, those risks go up. I would never recommend anybody uses an old rebreather at all. I wouldn't even recommend using a new rebreather unless you've got the training to use it and you know what you're doing. And then I would not recommend a dodgy old rebreather on top of that. I'm not saying these rebreathers were bad in the day when they were made. As far as I'm aware, the Soviet rebreathers were very good back in the day. The issue is that rebreathers all have risks associated with them. As they get older, those risks go up. And it's not like a gas mask, risk where it's simply the valve might fail on the mask, or there might be a bit of an air leak which compromises the mask. You might die a horrifying death with a rebreather. So how rebreathers work in layman's terms, because as I've said, I'm not an expert on this, so if you do know what you're talking about, feel free to correct me, but don't just say it because you feel like calling me wrong on it. There's basically, rebreathers have a CO2 scrubber unit, which is like a chemical cartridge. Think of it like a gas mask filter, but it doesn't work particularly like a filter. Generally, rebreather, you breathe out, that air goes through the bladder into a tube, into this sort of filter thing, the scrubber unit, and then the air comes back into the mask. So it's basically, you're doing it on like a circuit, basically, of a rebreather. And how the CO2 scrubber works is that it scrubs CO2. So basically, when you exhale, you're exhaling both CO2 and oxygen, and probably a bit of nitrogen as well, I imagine. But what happens is, obviously, you can't breathe CO2, but you can breathe oxygen. So what the scrubber unit does is it basically keeps scrubbing the CO2, and I assume trapping it or chemically converting it. So you're only getting oxygen back. So there's a big bladder with a rebreather. As far as I'm aware, that's pre-filled with oxygen. And what happens is, as you breathe out, the scrubber unit is constantly using a chemical reaction to purge the CO2 from this closed cycle. So what would actually happen is that the unit itself is constantly, only allowing you to breathe fresh, safe air. So that's all good and fine. The first issue you have with rebreathers is, as the CO2 scrubber, keeps working, your oxygen is getting thinner and thinner, because every time you breathe it out, you're breathing out, oxygen and CO2. So if you're breathing in, I know you wouldn't normally breathe 100% oxygen, but let's just say for the sake of this, you're breathing in 100% oxygen. When you breathe it out, you might be only getting half of that, I don't know what the exact numbers are, recycled into oxygen. So every time you breathe in and out, there's less and less actual breathable oxygen in the unit, even with it scrubbing the CO2. So what happens is you can suffocate. And the problem is, from everybody I've heard talking about this, is that because there's no CO2, which causes you to have the choking reaction, the reaction where you actually feel like you need to breathe, like you're running out of air, what actually happens is you kind of just collapse, and before you know it, you basically don't have the energy to pull the mask off and you suffocate. It's probably not the most horrifying way to die, because it doesn't sound all that unpleasant, in terms of there's no horrible reaction to it. I think that is a suicide method people use, is kind of like that inert gas asphyxiation, because it's not particularly painful. The issue is that the reason you're wearing that is to survive, right? You're wanting to survive something, not kill yourself. So that's the primary thing with rebreathers, that even when they work perfectly, eventually, especially if you're not timing it very well, and you don't know exactly how long it's going to last, because different people probably need different amounts of oxygen, what's going to happen is you're obviously going to run out of breathable air and suffocate and not realise you're going to suffocate. So that's the big issue of rebreathers, and that's why you need training and everything to know how long to have it on for, how much you're exerting yourself in case you're breathing faster or slower and things like that, which will affect the time it can be used for. The second issue of rebreathers is they're inherently dangerous with how the scrubber works. Now, as far as I'm aware of CO2 scrubbers, they're normally okay as long as nothing goes wrong with them and it's a modern cartridge. If water gets in, lots of very bad things can happen. So one of the issues with rebreathers is if water gets into the CO2 scrubber, supposedly it can release toxic gas, so you end up poisoning yourself. And apparently one of the things it can do is like scald your lungs inside out, so even if you pulled it off, you're probably going to die slowly in hospital from your kind of destroyed lungs. So that's one of the issues. You can destroy your lungs from the inside out if the rebreather unit goes wrong, the CO2 scrubber. The next issue with it is, similarly, if water gets in, it can set on fire or explode. So first you have the issue that you could be wearing it and you could turn into, as people were saying in that K thread, the human depth charge. I did have a few people link me to it because I don't normally browse K, but long story short, if it wasn't somebody trolling, it was some idiot who was basically determined to use an old IP5 and the CO2 scrubber to go diving without using an actual diving watch, so he wouldn't be able to time himself underwater. You know, nobody assisting him diving. Basically somebody with a death wish. If he was using the best possible equipment, he'd have killed himself, but he was deciding to do it with an old rebreather. So the joke was somebody made, he's turning himself into human depth charge, he's diving in the water, doesn't know if his old CO2 scrubber's going to work, water's probably going to get in, he's going to spectacularly explode into giblets or burn himself like thermite. So yeah, you can either have poison gas released or your rebreather cartridge can set on fire or explode if water gets in or something else goes wrong with it, because it's a chemical reaction taking place. It's not a simple filter with charcoal and paper in all particulate sections. So yeah, there's that. So hopefully this video has explained to you why it's not a good idea to use a rebreather. You know, telling people just buy a rebreather, don't get a surplus mask, just buy any old rebreather, that'll work. No, don't listen to people that tell you that. Again, there are some safe rebreathers. Somebody in the comments was suggesting like miners' rebreathers that they use, but again, it's still a rebreather, so lots of caution with that. If you're going to get one that's brand new and in good order. Don't buy some second-hand one that's been sitting in a warehouse, God knows what's gone on with it, for 30 years, and then hoping that the air you breathe through that's going to be clean and not kill you. So, yeah. Rebreathers, there are practical uses for rebreathers. There can be times when rebreathers can be really practical, but they need to be used by people who are trained to use the rebreathers, probably in teams, so if something goes wrong, somebody else can pull your mask off for you. And if water gets in and lots of other issues, it can go wrong. And as I said, with like lots of these things, as they become surplus and are older, you don't know how they've been stored in a warehouse. As time goes on, maybe the chemical reaction changes differently. So please, 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 please do not use a rebreather unless you are trained and have a very current issue one. Don't think, wow, it might be easier than getting a gas mask, so I'm going to get a rebreather. No, get your respirator that works and a load of spare filters for it. And then if you want to get really serious, please buy an O2 tank with a regulator and like a fireman's mask or something like that, so you can have a positive pressure O2 mask, not a rebreather.